June 4, 1942, a carrier deck in the Pacific. A Japanese officer stands with a pen in his hand, writing down another of the morning's victories. His navy has not lost a battle in 6 months, and far above him, past clouds he has no reason to look up at, the thing that is about to erase that navy is already there. Unseen, all morning the Americans have come at his fleet, wave after wave, low over the water, and all morning he has watched them fail and fall and burn. He writes each one down. Attack repelled, attack repelled. He is sure he is winning, and he is right, for about 5 more minutes. How does the best morning in the history of a navy become its worst, in the time it takes to finish a paragraph? You already know how the battle ended. That was never the question. The question is what this one man could see from where he stood, and the one thing, right in front of him, that he never saw coming. He was writing it down as it happened, he just didn't know what he was writing. His name was Takahisa Amagai. He was the air officer aboard the carrier Kaga, and on the morning of June 4th, his job was to keep the record of the sky. Every plane that went up, every plane that came back, every report that reached the deck from the ships around him. It was a good job for a careful man, and Amagai was a careful man. You can picture the deck below him, the morning sun already high, the sea calm and open in every direction, sailors moving with the ease of men who have done this 100 times and never once been wrong. A carrier at work is a kind of clockwork. Planes spotted and ranged, engines run up, men in colored jerseys moving through a dance they know in their bones, each one trusting the next to do his part exactly the way he has always done it. That morning, the clockwork was running clean. Men who have been winning for 6 months carry themselves a certain way. There is a looseness in it, an ease, orders given quietly and followed at once, the steady confidence of a crew that has never yet had a reason to doubt the deck beneath its feet, or the man standing next to it. You would have felt it the moment you came aboard. It was in the air of that ship, the way the salt was. There was no fear on that deck. There was no reason for any. The page in front of Amagai told a simple story, and every line of it was correct. The strike they had sent against the island that morning had gone out and come home. The enemy planes that had found the fleet had been met and beaten and sent into the sea. The sky was theirs, the water was theirs, the morning was theirs. A careful man reads his own account, and this one said one word, over and over, in a hand that did not shake: winning. And the calm on that deck had roots that ran back much further than that single morning. That book did not begin on the morning of June 4th. It began 6 months earlier, and it had never once been interrupted. At Pearl Harbor, this same fleet had crossed 4,000 miles of empty ocean in radio silence and struck the American battle line where it lay at anchor, then slipped away over the horizon before the smoke had cleared. Then Wake Island, then Rabaul, then Darwin on the northern coast of Australia, where the bombs came down on a harbor that had told itself it was too far south to ever be touched, then west, all the way into the Indian Ocean, where this same fleet chased another empire's navy out of its own home waters and sank its ships almost as an afterthought. 6 months, a quarter of the way around the world. And in all of that time, against every navy that came at them, these carriers had not lost a single one of their number. Not one. The men on these ships were not the kind who bragged. They did not have to be. At that moment, they were very likely the finest carrier force in the world, the best trained crews, the most experienced pilots, flying from the decks that had already done what no navy in history had ever done. And there was something older and deeper than experience holding that confidence up. For the better part of 40 years, the Japanese Navy had trained for a single idea, one great battle. One morning when the enemy fleet would be found and met and destroyed in open water, the way they had destroyed the Russian fleet a generation before, in a victory the whole nation still taught its children. Every admiral in that navy had grown up on that story. That was the dream this navy had been built around. Everything in it, the ships, the guns, the training, the pride, pointed toward that one decisive morning. And on June 4th, from where Amagai stood, it looked as though the dream was finally coming true. The enemy had come to them. The enemy was being destroyed. The record was writing itself out exactly the way that doctrine had promised it would. That is the cruelest part of all of it. He was not misreading the morning by the standards he had been handed. He was reading it perfectly. The standards were the trap. So when Amagai stood on the Kaga and watched the Americans come and fail and watched his fleet hold, he was simply reading the newest line in a book that had never once told a lie. He had every reason on earth to believe the next line would read like all the others. That is what makes what happened next so hard to look away from. The Americans came at the fleet in waves all morning long, and each wave was worse for the men flying it than the one before. First came the planes from the island itself, early, before the day was fully warm. They came in, and they were thrown back. Then, as the morning wore on, came the ones that would decide everything, though no one on either side knew it yet, the torpedo planes. What it took to fly one of these attacks is the heart of the whole story. A torpedo has to be dropped low and slow and straight. There is no other way to do it. The plane has to come down almost to the surface of the sea, hold a steady line, and fly directly at a ship that is doing everything in its power to kill it. For long seconds, the pilot cannot turn. He cannot climb. He can do nothing but hold that line and pray. The American torpedo squadrons flew these attacks that morning without a single fighter to protect them. The men who led them knew exactly what that meant. One squadron commander took his men down toward the Japanese fleet, fully understanding that most of them, perhaps every last one of them, were not coming back, and they followed him anyway, in a straight line, into the guns. Think about what that asks of a man. Not a single flash of courage, a long-held, deliberate courage, seconds stretching out while the fire comes up to meet you, and the only thing you are allowed to do is keep flying straight at the thing that is killing you, because to turn away is to make the whole sacrifice mean nothing. They did not turn away. From the deck of the Kaga, it must have looked almost like a mistake, like watching men walk willingly into a fire. These planes had no chance, and every sailor at every gun could see it. The Japanese fighters fell on them from above. The guns of every ship in the fleet came around and opened up, and the torpedo planes came apart over the water, one after another, and went into the sea, squadron after squadron. First one carrier's planes, then another's, then a third's, over the better part of an hour. Almost none of the men in them lived. Amagai wrote it down. Attack repelled. Another squadron bored in. The same thing happened. Attack repelled. And here is what not one man on that deck could see. Those low, doomed, hopeless-looking attacks were not the failure they appeared to be. They were part of the reason the sky was about to fall in. To meet those planes down on the water, the Japanese fighters had come down too, all of them, down low, spread out of position, and, after a long morning of killing, low on fuel and low on ammunition. The high air, the air that a dive bomber falls out of, had been left open. Nobody had planned it that way. The Americans, still climbing far above, did not even know it had happened. It was not a scheme. It was the accidental price of an hour of slaughter. But the door had been left open, and it was the men in the torpedo planes, the men now going into the sea, who had left it open. They died buying something they would never live to see. One of them was a young pilot who had already dropped his torpedo, taken his hits, and gone down into the water in the very middle of the Japanese fleet. He was alive down there, wounded, hidden, holding on. The officer on the deck above never knew he was there. Remember him. We are going to come back to him. Those men in the torpedo planes never knew what their attack set up. Most of them never came home to find out. If you think they have earned a few seconds of being remembered, take one of those seconds right now and tap the like button. It is a small thing, but it is one of the ways a story like theirs stays out loud instead of going quiet. Now, back to the deck. The officer is still writing. He has about 3 minutes. The first thing that was wrong was the quiet, not silence. A carrier at battle stations is never silent. But something in the rhythm of the morning had slipped, the way a familiar song slips when one note comes in a half-beat late. The fighters that had filled the air with noise were somewhere else now, down low, off across the water, chasing the last of the torpedo planes, far from the ships they were supposed to be guarding. For a stretch of minutes, the sky directly over the fleet had almost no one minding it. Somewhere on the deck, a man tilted his head back and looked up. Maybe he shouted, maybe he only pointed, and could not find the breath to say what he saw. On the ships of that fleet, there was no machine that could look into the high air for him. No radar, nothing that reached up past the clouds to warn a captain what was already on its way down. There was only a man's eyes, and the sky, and however many seconds were left in it. Seconds. That is what it came down to in the end. Not the 6 months, not the 4,000 miles, not the decades of doctrine. Just a handful of seconds, and whether anyone happened to be looking up into the one part of the sky that no one had thought to watch, Amagai may have glanced up himself. A careful man would have. And then, most likely, he looked back down at his record, because the record was still true, and the morning was still theirs, and there was still a line to finish. The pen kept moving. High above the Kaga, an American named Wade McCluskey had brought his dive bombers over the fleet, looked down, found the enemy carriers with no one guarding the air above them, and tipped over into his dive. The men on the deck had a handful of seconds left. They did not know it yet, but they did. I have read a great deal about those 5 minutes over the years, and the detail that has always stayed with me is not the bombs. It is that a man had just finished writing the word for victory and never got to write the next line. What happened to the Kaga happened fast, too fast to lay out in order, because the men who lived it could not have told you the order of things either. One moment, the deck was a place where a careful officer kept a careful record. The next moment, the world tilted. The sound arrived before the mind could put a name to it. The light changed. The steady deck stopped being steady. The bombs came down out of that open high air, the air no one had been watching, and they found a ship that had no answer left to give. Up on the bridge, the captain of the Kaga, a man named Jisaku Okada, did not survive the first minutes. The place from which the ship was commanded was simply gone, and the record, the careful record, the true record, the 6-month record that had never once had to write the word lost, it went with it, into smoke, into a heat that no pen and no paper survive. Amagai lived. The air officer, the man who had spent his whole morning writing down victories, came through those first terrible minutes when so many around him did not, and because the men above him were gone, what was left of the ship became his to command. Think about that turn for a moment. The last thing he had done as a keeper of records was write that his side was winning. The first thing he did as a commander of men was try to save a ship that could not be saved. In the space of about 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's carriers had been torn open to the sky. The Kaga, the Akagi, flagship of the whole fleet, the Sōryū. And Amagai was not the only man keeping that book. On every one of those ships, that same morning, someone else was writing the same word he was. An officer on the Akagi, an officer on the Sōryū. Careful men, honest men, all of them reading the same true page and reaching the same true conclusion. They were all winning. Every one of them was right, and every one of those records ended within minutes of the others, in the same smoke, under the same open sky. By that same evening, a 4th carrier would follow the first 3. For a few hours, that 4th ship, the Sōryū, fought on alone. She had been just far enough from the others to slip the first blow, and her own plane struck back hard, and for a little while the men aboard her may have let themselves believe the morning could still be pulled back from the edge. It could not. Late in the day, the same open sky found her too. One by one, all through that long afternoon, the ships that had carried the pride of a navy across the world went dark and began to burn. The force that had crossed a quarter of the earth without losing a single carrier lost 4 of them between breakfast and dark. And the hardest part, the part that is almost too neat to be believed, is that the record had been right, all the way up to the final line. They really had been winning, right up until the instant they were not. What came after the noise was a different kind of hard. A ship that is dying does not die all at once. It gives its crew time to fight for it, and slowly, time to understand that the fight is already lost. Amagai had that time. He led men back toward the fires to do what could still be done, to save the ship that had been the solid ground under his feet only an hour before, back when that ground had felt like the safest place in the entire world. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. There is no record of what a man thinks while he does a thing like that. Amagai never left us one, and it would be wrong to invent one for him. But what was true is clear enough, whether he ever let himself put it into words or not. Every certainty he had carried onto that deck at sunrise was gone by the middle of the day. The book that had never lied had ended in the middle of a sentence. The sea that had been theirs was filling with their own ships, burning, and the quiet confidence of that entire fleet, all 6 months of it, had turned out to rest on one single thin assumption, that the next line would look like all the ones that had come before. By nightfall, the arithmetic was beyond any argument. The heart of the fleet was gone. The men who could not be replaced, the veteran crews, the trained hands, the pilots a nation had spent years building one at a time, were in the water or beneath it. 6 months of running wild had ended in 5 minutes of a single morning, and no line written in any book could put a word of it back. So here is the question we started with, and here, at last, is the answer. How does the best morning in the history of a navy become its worst, in the time it takes to finish a paragraph? It was never really about the battle. You knew the battle before you ever clicked on this. It was about the distance between what a record can measure and what is actually happening. Amagai's record was honest. Every line of it was true. The strike launched. The attacks repelled. The sea held. But a record can only ever write down what a man is able to see. And there was one thing that careful officer could not see: the open door up in the high air, and the men who had died to hold it open for the ones coming behind them. His instruments could not measure that. His doctrine could not imagine it. His own eyes could not reach that high. So he wrote victory. And he was telling the truth. And the truth was a trap. Now, that young pilot in the water, the one I ask you to remember, He had gone in with the torpedo planes. One of 15 his squadron flew off the carrier Hornet that morning, behind a commander who led them straight at the fleet. Of those 15 planes, of those 30 men, he was the only one who came back. Shot down, wounded in the arm and the leg, he had pulled himself free of a sinking plane in the middle of the enemy fleet and hidden in the open water beneath a seat cushion that floated loose, small enough and still enough that no one found him. And from down there, from inside the very fleet he had been sent to attack, he watched. He watched 3 of the carriers his squadron had come to attack, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Sōryū, turn, one by one, into towers of black smoke that leaned up against the sky. He stayed in that water for 30 hours before an American flying boat finally spotted him and lifted him out. He was burned, and he was shot through, and he had spent a day and a night watching an enemy die all around him, and when they pulled him from the sea, he was still holding on. He would carry what he saw in that water for the rest of his life. He had been handed the strangest seat in the whole battle, a seat down inside the enemy's own fleet, low on the water, close enough to hear it happen, close enough to watch the smoke climb, and know exactly what it meant. He had done exactly the thing those men in the torpedo planes were sent to do. He had gone in against the odds. He had helped hold the door open. He had paid for it. And, almost alone among them, he had lived to see it work. The record on the Kaga never wrote his name. It never wrote down what he and his squadron had truly done, because the man keeping it could not see it, and by the time anyone on that ship might have understood, the record was already ash. But it happened. It is one of the truest things in this entire story. And the fact that his enemy's careful book never once recorded it does not make it one bit less true. It only tells you that the record was never the place where the truth was living. We tell this story from the deck of the Kaga for a reason. Not to stand in an enemy's shoes and feel sorry for him. He chose his war, and his navy chose the morning it sailed into. We tell it from up there because it is the only place you can truly see the size of what those American flyers did. You cannot measure it from the American side. From the American side, it looks like a run of terrible luck and a wave of good men lost. It is only from the enemy's own deck, from the pen of a man writing victory while his navy has minutes left to live, that you can see the truth of it plainly. The men who beat that fleet did not look, at the time, like they were winning. Right up to the end, they looked like they were losing. That was the disguise the whole thing wore, and it worked. Every carrier that burned that afternoon had sailed to that spot to fight one great battle and win it. They got their great battle. It simply belonged to someone else. And the men it belonged to, the ones in the low, slow planes, the ones who flew straight into the guns so that others could come falling out of the empty sky behind them, most of them never knew they had won anything at all. They were gone before the smoke even rose. That is the true shape of what happened over that ocean. Those men handed the war forward, at the highest price there is, and trusted the rest of us to understand, later, what they had done. That officer spent a morning writing down a war he was certain he understood. The one thing he never managed to write, the thing his book simply had no line for, was the men who reached up into an open sky and turned his entire morning over. Their names deserve to be said out loud. So let us keep saying them. That officer's morning survived because someone wrote it down. But some of the best stories from this war were never written down at all. They were told once, at a kitchen table, by a father or a grandfather who was there, and who only ever mentioned it the one time. If you carry a story like that, something he told you that you have never read in any book, put it in the comments below. Write it down here, where it won't disappear. Those men counted on us to remember them. Let's make sure we do.
Kaname Harada, June 4th, 1942. Somewhere over the Pacific, north of Midway Atoll. His carrier, the Sōryū, is burning below him. Black smoke pouring off the flight deck. Flames where the aircraft used to be. He had taken off from that deck hours earlier. Now it is gone. He banks his Zero toward the Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier still afloat, and sets down on her flight deck. The maintenance crew takes one look at his plane. It is so full of holes, they order it pushed over the side. A spare Zero is brought up from below decks. Harada climbs in. A few hours later, American dive bombers find the Hiryu, too. Harada is in the air when it happens. He glances back, and a wall of hot air slams his aircraft sideways. The entire flight deck vanishes beneath fire and smoke. No place left to land. Anywhere. He fights until his ammunition runs out, then locks his canopy open, drops the flaps, and pushes the nose down. He pancakes into the sea beside a Japanese destroyer. His watch had stopped at 3:26 that afternoon. It would never move again. They pull him out of the water. He's alive. And here is the part that most people get wrong. Most of his fellow pilots are alive too. The standard story says Midway destroyed Japan's best pilots. It didn't. Out of roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews in the Japanese Navy, about 110 died at Midway. 36 on the carriers, 74 in the air. The rest were pulled from the water, transferred to destroyers, counted, and sent home. They survived the battle that changed the Pacific War. But within 12 months, nearly all of them were gone. Not because of what America did next, because of what Japan did. 5 minutes. That's all it took. American SBD Dauntless dive bombers came screaming down from 14,000 feet, while every Japanese Zero fighter was stuck at wave-top level, dragged down there by American torpedo bomber crews, who knew full well they were not coming back. 5 minutes later, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. The 4th was hit that afternoon. But the pilots, most of them, survived. And then Japan made 3 decisions that made that survival meaningless. June 14th, 1942. The anchorage at Hashirajima, in the inland sea of Japan. The surviving warships of the Japanese fleet slipped into port quietly. No ceremony, no flags, no bands playing on the dock, no victory celebration. The harbor that had sent them off with confidence 10 days earlier now received them in silence. The battleships and cruisers dropped anchor in their usual positions. But the spaces where the carriers should have been, Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, Hiryu, were empty. 4 of the finest aircraft carriers on Earth had sailed out of these waters. None of them came back. The wounded were moved off the ships immediately, transferred to naval hospitals on the mainland, and then they were classified as secret patients, placed in isolation wards, separated from other patients, barred from seeing their own families. Wives who came to the hospitals were turned away. Mothers received no information. The men who had just fought in one of the most important naval battles in history were locked behind closed doors, and the doors stayed shut for over a year. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a great victory. The wounded knew otherwise. So Japan made them disappear. The healthy survivors got a different kind of silence. Officers and enlisted men were broken up and dispersed across the fleet, reassigned to other units, scattered. They were forbidden from visiting their families, forbidden from contacting friends. Many were shipped directly to bases in the South Pacific. Captain Kawaguchi, the senior air officer aboard the Hiryu, later told American interrogators that the surviving pilots were distributed between the carriers Zuikaku and Shikaku and various units across the Solomon Islands. Distributed. The word is precise, not reorganized, not reassigned with purpose. Distributed, the way you distribute spare parts. And here is what that silence actually cost Japan. The men who had just witnessed what American dive bombers could do, the men who understood, better than anyone alive. The fatal gap in Japanese fleet air defense were the exact men who could have reshaped Japanese carrier doctrine. They had seen the Zeros pulled down to sea level by the torpedo bombers. They had seen the sky above the fleet left wide open. They knew exactly how the American attack had worked. Japan silenced every one of them. The Navy did not tell the Army what had happened. The Army continued to believe that the carrier fleet was intact and fully operational. Decisions the Army made in the Solomon Islands, decisions that sent tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers into the jungle, were based on a lie. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top Zero aces, stationed at Leh in New Guinea, had no idea what had happened at Midway. None. He knew that an operation had been planned. He knew that Midway was supposed to be taken. But no one told him the fleet had lost 4 carriers. No one told him the Kido Butai, the striking force that had owned the Pacific since December, no longer existed. He only began to suspect a disaster when American forces landed on Guadalcanal 2 months later. How could the Americans go on the offensive, he wondered, if Midway had been a victory? He and his fellow pilots at Leh could only whisper among themselves. No official word came down. No briefing. No explanation. The whispers were all they had. And because the Army did not know the truth, it continued to make plans as though the Navy could still control the sea and the sky. Reinforcements were sent to Guadalcanal by transport ship without adequate air cover, because the Army believed air cover was available. It was not. Those transports sailed into waters that the Japanese Navy could no longer protect, and the men aboard them paid for a lie they had never been told, and not a single flag officer was held accountable. Vice Admiral Nagumo, the man who commanded the carrier striking force when all 4 carriers were destroyed, was given command of the rebuilt carrier force. According to post-war accounts, the reason was simple. Nagumo had reported sinking 2 American carriers at Midway. The actual number was 1, the Yorktown. But the lie was good enough to protect his career. Now, here is where the numbers matter. And where most people, even those who know Midway well, get the story wrong. The battle was devastating. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors lost their lives, most of them while trying to save their ships. Damage control parties trapped below decks, engine room crews scalded by ruptured steam lines. Ordnance men caught in the chain explosions of armed aircraft packed wingtip to wingtip in the hangars. More than 700 aircraft technicians and maintenance specialists went down with the carriers. These were not men who could be replaced by running an ad in the newspaper. Pre-war Japan was far less mechanized than the United States. The percentage of the population with technical and mechanical training was a fraction of America's. Those 700 men represented a generation of institutional knowledge: how to arm a torpedo bomber in rough seas, how to spot aircraft on a pitching flight deck, how to keep Zeros flying 3,000 miles from the nearest factory. That knowledge sank with them. All 248 carrier aircraft were destroyed. Most never left the hangar decks. They burned where they sat. The carriers, irreplaceable. The technicians, irreplaceable. The aircraft, replaceable, but only with time. And the pilots? The men Japan had spent years training to the highest standard on Earth. They were still alive. Japan had one chance to rebuild around them, to take the only asset it could not manufacture and protect it. Instead, Japan chose to burn them. There's a pattern in every military collapse I've studied. The moment an institution starts hiding from its own people what the enemy just did to them, it has already decided to lose. It just hasn't admitted it yet. Japan had silenced its own survivors. That was the first decision. The second was worse. The surviving pilots needed somewhere to go. Japan had 2 fleet carriers left, the Zuikaku and the Shokaku. Both had missed Midway. Shokaku was still in dry dock repairing bomb damage from the Coral Sea. Zuikaku was untouched, but her air group had been shot to pieces there, and the Japanese Navy refused to transfer Shokaku's surviving air crews to fill the gaps. So both stayed home while the Kido Butai sailed to its destruction without them. Some of the surviving Midway veterans were reassigned to those ships. They would fly again from carrier decks. But many others, men who had flown every major operation since Pearl Harbor, were not put aboard carriers. They were sent to land-based air units. Sent south. Sent to the one place in the Pacific where the fighting was about to become the most intense and the most unforgiving, Rabaul. A Japanese airbase on the northern tip of New Britain, deep in the South Pacific. From Rabaul, Japanese pilots flew missions against one target above all others, Guadalcanal. And this is where Japan's second decision turned into a death sentence. The distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal was over 600 miles. One way. For a Zero fighter, that was close to the absolute outer limit of its combat range. A pilot taking off from Rabaul at dawn would fly for more than 4 hours just to reach the airspace over Guadalcanal. 4 hours of open ocean. 4 hours of burning fuel. By the time he arrived, if the weather held, if he found the island, his fuel tanks gave him maybe 10 to 15 minutes of combat before he had to turn around and fly 4 hours back. 15 minutes. That was the window. Miss it by 5 minutes and the Pacific swallowed you. American pilots at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal had a very different problem. Their problem was that they were too close. A Wildcat could be airborne and over the fight within minutes. Full fuel, full ammunition, rested. And if a Wildcat took damage, the pilot could glide back to Henderson Field, land on a dirt strip, and be up again the next day in a repaired aircraft. A Zero pilot with a damaged engine over Guadalcanal had over 600 miles of empty ocean between him and the nearest friendly mechanic. The math was unforgiving. Japan was sending its best pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, of Midway, of the Indian Ocean raids, into combat at the end of a 600-mile fuel line against American pilots who were fighting over their own airfield. Every engagement favored the Americans. Every damaged aircraft favored the Americans. Every wounded pilot favored the Americans. The exchange rate was built into the geography, and nothing Japan did could change it. On August 7th, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, and the skies over the Solomon Islands became the place where Japan's surviving elite went to die. The Eastern Solomons. August 1942. Casualty rates among Japanese aviators matched what they had suffered at Midway. Santa Cruz. October 1942. The same. Japanese officers later told American interrogators that the surviving Midway pilots participated in the Battle of Santa Cruz. They noted that pilot quality had already begun to decline due to heavy attrition. Over 1,000 Japanese aircraft were lost during the Solomon Islands campaign. 1,000. And the men flying them were not replacements. Not yet. They were the veterans. The men who had been flying Zeros since before the war started. The men Japan could not replace. The Solomons did not just consume aircraft. It consumed the last generation of Japanese pilots who knew what they were doing, and one of them was Kaname Harada. July 1942. Harada was reassigned to the carrier Hio. In early October, the Hio sailed from Japan to join the Guadalcanal campaign. October 17th, 1942. Harada was part of a fighter escort protecting a force of torpedo bombers heading toward Guadalcanal. American F-4F Wildcats hit the formation. Harada probably downed one of them. Then he took a round in the left arm. His Zero was shattered. He crash-landed near the Japanese base at Rakata Bay on Santa Isabel Island. The aircraft came apart around him. He was pinned underneath the wreckage. He dug himself out with his bare hands. His fingernails tore off. He could see bone through the torn skin of his fingers. When he finally pulled himself free, he was alone, bleeding, in a jungle he had never seen before. He walked for days, through dense tropical forest, through rain. He contracted malaria, then dengue fever. He found the body of a Japanese bomber crewman who had also gone down. Another crewman was still alive, but barely. His injuries were beyond help. The dying man asked Harada to cut some of his hair and take it back to his family. Harada stayed with the man until he was gone. That delay, it turned out, saved Harada's life. It kept him from walking into the path of an American patrol. He eventually reached a Japanese midget submarine base and was evacuated on a hospital ship back to Japan. His flying career was over. One arm was too badly damaged. He would never fly combat again. He was 26 years old. 4 months earlier. He had been one of the finest fighter pilots on Earth. Now he was a flight instructor with a ruined arm and a watch that would never move past 326. Now, here is the contrast that matters. America lost pilots at Midway, too. In some squadrons, the losses were staggering. Worse, in percentage terms, than anything the Japanese suffered in the air that day. Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, from the carrier Hornet, 15, TBD, Devastator torpedo bombers, 30 men, 15 pilots, and 15 rear seat gunners. They flew straight into the Japanese fleet without fighter escort. The Zeros came down on them like a wall. The Devastators were slow, underpowered, practically defenseless against a Zero in a diving attack. One by one, they went into the water. 29 men did not come back. One man survived. Ensign George Gay. Shot down, wounded. He floated alone in the Pacific with his life vest and watched from the water as American dive bombers destroyed the Japanese carriers. He was picked up the next day. VT-8's loss was devastating, but what the United States Navy did next made all the difference. America did not hide what happened. It studied it. Every after-action report was collected, read, analyzed, argued over. What went wrong with torpedo doctrine? Why the coordination between fighters and bombers failed? What changes needed to be made to aircraft, to tactics, to communications? The losses were treated as data, painful, expensive data, and the data was used. And America did not scatter its surviving veterans across the Pacific to fight alone until they were used up. It did not pretend the battle had never happened. It did not silence the men who had been there. The difference between the two navies after Midway was not technology. It was not courage. Both sides had plenty of both. The difference was what each side did with the truth, and with the men who carried it. If your father, your grandfather, or anyone you ever knew served in the Pacific, or anywhere in that war, hit the like button. This story is for them. Before the war, the Japanese Navy had built the most selective pilot training program on Earth. The numbers tell the story. When Kaname Harada entered the program, according to one account, 1,500 men signed up. 26 completed it. 4 years of physical punishment, constant testing, and elimination. The men who survived the pipeline emerged as extraordinary aviators, skilled, disciplined, conditioned for carrier operations. But the system had a flaw that nobody cared about in peacetime. It could not scale. The program was designed to produce a small number of elite pilots for a fleet that expected short, decisive wars, high quality, low volume, no surge capacity, no backup plan. When Japan went to war, it had roughly 2,000 carrier-qualified aircrews. That was supposed to be enough. After Midway and the Solomons, the Navy needed hundreds of replacement pilots immediately. The system that had taken 4 years to produce 26 men was now being asked to produce hundreds in months. It broke. Japan pushed recruits through abbreviated training programs. Flight hours were slashed. Where pre-war Japanese pilots had trained for years, mastering formation flying, gunnery, navigation, carrier landings in all weather, the new men were getting weeks. They arrived at operational squadrons having barely learned to fly straight and level. Carrier landings were a terror. Gunnery was poor. Navigation over open ocean, the single most critical skill for a Pacific pilot, was almost non-existent. And then the fuel ran out. American submarines were strangling Japan's oil supply. The Maru ships, the tankers that carried crude oil from the Dutch East Indies back to Japan, were being torpedoed at an accelerating rate. Every tanker that went to the bottom took fuel with it. Fuel for warships, fuel for aircraft, and fuel for training. By 1943, training airfields in Japan were rationing aviation gasoline. New pilots sat on the ground while their fuel allotments were diverted to frontline units. When they did fly, the hours were short, the conditions controlled, and the skills they needed most, combat maneuvering, deflection shooting, low-altitude carrier recovery, went unpracticed. Training aircraft remained a low-production priority throughout the entire war. Japan built fighters and bombers for combat. It did not build the trainers needed to create the pilots to fly them. Captain Kawaguchi, in his post-war interrogation, laid it out clearly. Pilot quality deteriorated because of insufficient training facilities, massive attrition, and a shortage of fuel. The Navy was forced to use inadequately trained replacements, and Japan never rotated its veterans home to teach. That single decision, or rather, that single refusal, made everything else irrelevant. The experienced pilots stayed in combat. They flew mission after mission, week after week, until they were gone. The knowledge they carried, how to manage fuel over long missions, how to coordinate attacks on enemy carriers, how to survive against radar-directed American fighters, went with them. None of it was passed down. None of it was captured. It simply vanished, one pilot at a time. The American Navy did the opposite. The United States massively expanded its pilot training infrastructure, new airfields across the American South and Southwest, new schools, thousands of new instructors. And the most important decision of all, combat veterans were rotated home and placed in training commands. A man who had survived the Coral Sea taught young pilots what it felt like to have a zero on your tail. A man who had lost his squadron leader at Midway explained what happens when your formation breaks apart. A man who had fought above the jungles of Guadalcanal showed students how to use cloud cover, how to conserve ammunition, how to break off an engagement when the odds turned. A young American pilot arriving at his first squadron in 1944 had been taught by men who had actually been there. The lessons were not theoretical. They were personal, and they kept men alive. New American pilots entered combat with hundreds more flight hours than their Japanese counterparts. They flew better aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat replaced the F-4F Wildcat. The Hellcat was faster, tougher, climbed harder, and was built from the ground up to defeat the Zero. Their carriers were equipped with radar that could detect incoming raids at distances over 100 miles. Their fighter directors, officers who sat in darkened combat information centers staring at radar screens, could vector Hellcats onto Japanese formations before the enemy pilots even knew they were being tracked. By June 1944, 2 years after Midway, the gap between the two air forces was no longer a gap. It was an abyss. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19th and 20th, 1944. The largest carrier versus carrier engagement in history. 9 Japanese carriers against 15 American carriers. Over 1,300 carrier aircraft in the water. The Japanese launched 4 massive strike waves against the American fleet. What happened next was not a battle. It was a reckoning. American radar picked up the incoming Japanese formations at long range. Fighter directors calmly vectored Hellcats to intercept. The Japanese pilots, most of them with a handful of months' training, flew into disciplined formations of American fighters flown by men who had trained under Midway and Guadalcanal veterans. The result was lopsided, beyond anything either Navy had ever seen. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost nearly 600 aircraft in 2 days. The Americans lost 123, and most of those were lost not to enemy action, but to fuel exhaustion during a long-range evening strike. The Japanese pilots who flew those missions had minimal training, outdated tactics, and aircraft that could no longer compete. They flew straight into the most sophisticated carrier air defense system ever assembled. Radar, directed fighter intercepts, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, and they were swept from the sky. The system that had produced the finest carrier pilots on Earth in 1941, the system that had created Harada and Sakai and Maeda and every other ace who had dominated the Pacific skies for 6 months, had by 1944 produced men who struggled to land on their own flight decks. And that was the direct result of a choice. Japan chose not to rebuild, chose not to learn, chose not to protect the knowledge that its surviving veterans carried. America made the opposite choice. And 2 years later, the results were visible from horizon to horizon across the Philippine Sea. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm could no longer fight a conventional carrier battle. The pilots did not have the skill. The aircraft did not have the performance. The carriers did not have the planes. So Japan found a new use for its pilots. The Special Attack Force, kamikaze. A pilot who could not aim a bomb could still aim a plane. That is what it came down to. Not spiritual devotion, though the propaganda said otherwise. Not ancient warrior codes, though the speeches invoked them. Mathematics. Cold. Simple mathematics. When an air force can no longer put ordnance on target through skill, when the pilots cannot hit a moving ship from altitude, cannot coordinate a torpedo attack, cannot survive long enough to line up a bomb run, the only variable left is the pilot's body. The plane becomes the bomb. The pilot becomes the fuse, and the training required drops to almost nothing. Fly toward the ship. Do not pull up. And that was the logical endpoint of 3 decisions. Silence the experience. Burn the veterans. Refuse to rebuild the system. Follow that sequence long enough, and you arrive at a place where young men with a few dozen hours of flight time are strapped into aircraft loaded with explosives and pointed at American ships. Takeshi Maeda knew what that looked like from the inside. Takeshi Maeda was a torpedo bomber pilot. On December 7th, 1941, he flew one of the aircraft that struck the USS West Virginia at Pearl Harbor. He was 20 years old. He remembered following Commander Fuchida's flare signal, forming up in single file for the torpedo run, and watching the anti-aircraft fire thicken as each plane went in. He was the second aircraft in line. His torpedo hit. The West Virginia took several more after his. She settled to the bottom of the harbor. Over the next 3.5 years, Maeda flew combat missions across the Pacific, battle after battle, island after island. He survived them all. Later in the war, at Okinawa, he was on a night attack against a group of American ships when flares lit up the water below. There, sitting in his bomb site, was the West Virginia, the same ship he had hit at Pearl Harbor. The Americans had raised her from the mud, repaired her, and sent her back to fight. He could not believe it. By August 1945, Maeda had accumulated 3,800 hours of combat flight time. 3,800. That number is almost incomprehensible. It represents years in the cockpit, dozens of engagements, an accumulation of skill and instinct that no training program on Earth could replicate. More experience than nearly any pilot in any navy on either side of the war. And in August 1945, the Japanese Navy assigned him to the Special Attack Force. His words, recorded by the National World War II Museum. I had accumulated 3,800 hours of combat flying experience. I couldn't believe my commanders wanted to waste all that in a single mission. His flight was scheduled for August 16th, 1945. Japan surrendered on August 14th. 2 days. That was the margin. 3,800 hours. Every takeoff, every landing, every engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to Okinawa. The full arc of the Pacific War compressed into one man's logbook. And the system that had kept him alive through all of it was about to spend him in a single dive. 2 days stood between Takeshi Maeda and an explosive-laden cockpit pointed at an American warship. 2 days stood between 3,800 hours of hard-won skill and a column of smoke on the water. And then there is Harada, the pilot whose watch stopped at 3:26 in the afternoon, somewhere in the Pacific north of Midway. After the war, Harada worked as a dairy farmer. He failed at nearly everything he tried. Selling apples, milking cows, laboring on other people's land. In 1965, his wife asked him a question. If you want to atone for the lives you have taken, what better way is there than to nurture new lives? He opened a nursery for children, then a kindergarten. He ran it for decades. In 1991, during the Gulf War, he overheard young Japanese people watching American airstrikes on television and describing the bombing as if it were a video game. Something broke in him. He resolved to speak out. He spent the next 25 years traveling to schools in Japan and the United States, telling anyone who would listen what war actually looked like from inside a cockpit. He traveled to the United States. He met Joe Foss, the American Marine ace who was believed to have been the pilot who shot him down over Guadalcanal. Foss's plane had taken 240 hits in that fight. The two men who had tried to destroy each other at point-blank range in 1942 sat across from each other decades later and talked about their children. They became friends. Harada went back to Santa Isabel Island and found the wreckage of his Zero still lying in the jungle where he had crashed. He brought a piece of it home. He opposed efforts to change Japan's pacifist constitution. He told audiences that the politicians pushing for change had been born after the war and did not understand what they were asking for. In this respect, he said, they are like our pre-war leaders. He worked at his kindergarten until he was 95. He died on May 3rd, 2016. He was 99 years old. He was the last known surviving combat pilot who had flown a Zero during the early battles of the Pacific War. The line from Midway to Kamikaze is not a mystery. It is not complicated. It does not require theories about culture or ideology or national character. It requires only the facts, laid end to end. June 1942. Japan's best carrier pilots survive 5 minutes of American dive bombing at Midway. June 14th, 1942. Japan classifies its own wounded as secret patients, silences the survivors, and scatters them across the Pacific. August through November 1942. America's Guadalcanal offensive grinds them down, one by one, at the end of a 600-mile fuel line they can never shorten. 1943. Japan's pilot training system collapses under the weight of losses it cannot replace and a fuel shortage it cannot solve. June 1944. The Philippine Sea. The Turkey Shoot. The gap between the two air forces is no longer a gap. It is an abyss. October 1944. The first kamikaze attacks. The body replaces the bomb. Skill is no longer required. Only obedience. It is a straight line. And it was drawn the day Japan decided to hide what American dive bombers did in 5 minutes. Most of the men who flew those dive bombers are gone now. The youngest World War II veterans are in their late 90s. And every year, we lose more of them. But their stories don't have to disappear with them. Maybe your grandfather flew in the Pacific and never talked about it. Maybe your father told you something once, at the kitchen table, late at night, that you've carried with you ever since. Maybe it was just one sentence, one name, one place he never wanted to go back to. Whatever it is, write it down in the comments. Because a story that lives only in one person's memory is one heartbeat away from being lost forever. And the men who lived it deserve better than that.
June 19th, 1944. The sky over the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Alex Vrachu rolls his Hellcat over and drops into a dive. Over the next 8 minutes, he will shoot down 6 Japanese aircraft. 6. In 8 minutes. He does it with 360 rounds, a fraction of what he was carrying. And across that same sky, he is not flying alone. The men going down around him fly for a navy that, 2 years earlier, had every American pilot in this ocean flying scared. Their airplane, the Zero, had once made American pilots afraid to turn, afraid to climb, afraid to fight it at all. So how did it come to this? And here is the stranger question. When the few Japanese pilots who lived through 1944 tried to describe the American plane that was doing the killing, they did not reach for the word deadly. They reached for a word you'd use for a long day of hard labor, for something that grinds a man down until there's nothing left in him. Exhausting. This is the story, told from inside the American cockpit, of the airplane that took the fear out of one Air Force and put a bone-deep tiredness into the other, built by men and women in a factory on Long Island, people who had already decided how it would end. Go back 2 years, and the picture is not this one. In the summer of 1942, an American pilot climbed into his Grumman Wildcat carrying a list, not a list of things to do, a list of things he was never, under any circumstances, allowed to do. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to climb away from one. Never let yourself get slow in front of one. He had those rules read to him in briefings. He heard them from the men who had already been out there, the ones who came back a little quieter than they'd left. And this is the part worth being honest about. Those rules were not fear-talking. They were arithmetic. The Zero could outturn and outclimb anything the Americans put in the air, and it was killing them for it. The numbers were real. The empty bunks were real. Coral Sea, Midway, and then the long, grinding months over Guadalcanal, where the fighting never seemed to stop and the losses never seemed to end. American pilots went up in an airplane they'd been told they could not win with, against an enemy who had every reason to believe he couldn't lose, and they went up anyway, day after day. That took a kind of courage that doesn't come with a medal. It just comes with getting back in the cockpit tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, knowing exactly what's waiting for you up there. Some of them didn't come back. Their friends flew the next mission anyway, over the same water, past the same empty spot in the formation where a man had been the day before. That was the price of buying time, and time was the one thing America needed, because 2,000 miles away, the answer was already being built. And here's the thing about Americans backed into a corner. They don't just take the beating, they start doing math on it. There was a Navy pilot named Jimmy Thatch who looked at everything the Zero could do to a Wildcat and, instead of accepting it, sat down on the ground and solved it. Not in the air. At a table, at night, moving matchsticks around like little airplanes, 2 of them against many, until he found a pattern. A way for a pair of slower planes to cover each other, so that the enemy who dove on one flew straight into the guns of the other. They would call it the Thack Weave, and it kept American pilots alive at the worst possible time, not because their airplane was better, but because their thinking was. Thack's own wingman in those years was a young man named Butch O'Hare, who would become the Navy's first ace of the war, and the first naval aviator of the war to earn the Medal of Honor. These were the men holding the line in 1942. Outgunned, outclimbed, and outthinking it anyway. But make no mistake about where the arithmetic still stood that summer. It favored the enemy, and the Zero's sharpest weapon wasn't its guns or its climb. It was that list, because a man who believes he's outmatched flies differently. He hesitates. He takes the safe angle instead of the killing one. He is half beaten before the first shot. By the middle of 1942, that hesitation had been quietly installed inside American naval aviation, and it was costing lives every week. What Tokyo did not count on was that the Americans had looked at that list of forbidden things and decided it was temporary. 2,000 miles away, in a factory in Bethpage on Long Island, other Americans were already tearing it up. Before we go on, if you believe stories like this one deserve to be remembered, take 1 second and tap that like button. It costs you nothing. And it's a small part of how these men stay remembered. Now, back to it. It didn't start with an engineer. It started with 3 fighter pilots and a president, Butch O'Hare, Jimmy Thatch, Jimmy Flatley. 3 of the best the Navy had, men who had looked the Zero in the face and lived. And they carried a plain message all the way up to Franklin Roosevelt himself. The Navy needed a fighter that could get upstairs faster, a plane that didn't ask its pilots to be perfect just to survive. Grumman, on Long Island, went and built it, and there is a small irony worth telling, because it says everything about how the Americans worked. The airplane that would break the back of Japanese naval aviation started life as an insurance policy, a backup, in case another new Navy fighter ran into trouble in development. Leroy Grumman and his chief designer, Bob Hall, took that assignment and made something far greater out of it. Hall went and talked to pilots who had fought through the Battle of Britain, gathered every hard lesson he could, and folded all of it into the new design. That's the American habit right there. Take the humble job, listen to the men who've actually been shot at, and quietly build something that changes the war. And they built it fast. Work was approved in the summer of 1941. The first prototype was in the air by June of 1942, and when they hung the right engine on it and flew it against a captured Japanese Zero, the new American plane was 30 miles an hour faster, the very first time out. Then Grumman did the thing American industry did in that war and made look ordinary. They built it by the thousands. At peak production, one Hellcat rolled off the Bethpage assembly line every single hour, around the clock, 7 days a week. Before it was over, that one factory turned out more than 12,000 of these fighters, 11,000 of them in just 2 years. And here is a detail worth sitting with. A great many of the people building them were women, mothers, a lot of them. Grumman put a daycare on the grounds so they could leave their children close by and go build the airplane that would bring somebody else's son home. There were no strikes on that line, no stoppages, and as the war went on, Grumman actually drove the price of the airplane down, not up. That's not a business story. That's a whole country deciding it was going to win and putting its shoulder into it, men and women, on the line and in the cockpit both. Leroy Grumman had started the company in a garage on Long Island in 1929, and by the middle of the war, his people were building warplanes the Navy could not get enough of, and building them well enough to earn award after award for the quality coming off that line. The man's name went on the airplane, and the airplane earned the name back. The pilots had a name for what came out of that factory. They called Grumman the Iron Works, not because of the paperwork or the production numbers, because their Grumman airplanes could take a beating that should have killed them and carry them home anyway. The men who flew the things named the company after the one quality that saved their lives. Think about what it means that the pilots themselves chose that name. Not the Speedworks, not the Gunworks, the Iron Works, because when the fight was over and the shooting was done, what a man remembered was that the airplane had held together long enough to get him back to the deck. Hold on to that, because it's the whole idea. Listen to something Jimmy Flatley said about the older Wildcat, before the new plane even existed. "It shoots the enemy down in flames," he said, "and brings most of us home." Brings most of us home. That was the American idea of what a fighter is for. And the new airplane was going to drive that idea further than anyone ever had. Now put the two machines side by side. The enemy had built the Zero by taking things away. No armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no weight that didn't directly serve speed and turn. They stripped the fighter to the bone to make it light, and whatever that bought them in the air, it left the man inside it with almost nothing between his body and an American bullet. Japan built an airplane and spent the pilot to fly it. The Americans built theirs the other way. They added armor plate behind the pilot's seat and behind his head, better than 200 pounds of it. Fuel tanks wrapped so a hit that should have turned the plane into a torch would seal itself and keep flying. A windscreen thick enough to turn a cannon shell at the right angle. Japan built a machine to kill a man. America built one to bring a man home. That was the whole argument, sitting right there in aluminum. Then there was the engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, the Double Wasp, the same brute of a power plant that hauled the big Army Thunderbolts around Europe, 2,000 horsepower, close to double what the Zero had. And famous for one thing above all, it kept running. Americans came home in that airplane with cylinders shot away, with whole sections of cowling gone, with damage that should have stopped the engine dead, and the R-2800 just kept hammering away, rough and loud and alive, and carried them back to the deck. Pilots told stories about limping home on an engine that had every right to quit, and didn't. That reputation wasn't marketing, it was earned. One shot-up airplane at a time. The new plane weighed nearly twice what a Zero weighed. On paper, that should have been a fatal problem. In the air, it was the answer, because all that weight came with all that power, and it made the Hellcat fast, faster than the Zero at altitude, far faster in a dive, fast at exactly the speeds where the Zero's controls turned stiff and heavy, where all that famous agility quietly drained out of it. Grumman gave it wide, sturdy landing gear too, so a tired young pilot could set it down on a pitching carrier deck in the dark and walk away. Every choice came back to the same place. Get him there, get him back. 6 50 caliber guns in the wings, and they were mounted to do one job without mercy. Put a wall of fire exactly where the pilot was looking. One good burst was enough to tear a lightly built enemy plane apart, and the airplane didn't stop at daylight. Later, Hellcats carried radar in a pod on the wing and hunted at night, so that even the cover of darkness stopped being a place the enemy could hide. Day or night, the ironworks kept finding them. And the Americans knew, precisely, not by guesswork, where the Zero was weak, because they had gotten their hands on one and taken it apart, and flown it against their own planes until they had mapped every strength and every flaw. That's a story for another day. What matters here is that the Hellcat wasn't a hope. It was an answer, engineered against a specific enemy, and the men who flew it were handed a new way to fight. Stop turning, stop chasing, come down from above, fast, hit, and climb back to altitude before he can bring his guns around. Then do it again, and fly in pairs, the way Thak had drawn it up with his matchsticks, so the man on your tail becomes the man in your partner's sights. The American pilot stopped reacting. He started choosing. He chose the speed, the angle, the altitude. He chose the fight. On August 31, 1943, off the carrier Yorktown, Jimmy Flatley, the same Flatley who'd carried the message to Roosevelt, led the first strike these new fighters ever flew against Marcus Island. The airplane worked. It worked so cleanly the men flying it could hardly believe it was the same war they'd been dreading. Late in 1943, the Japanese began meeting this airplane in numbers, and the reports they filed started to say the same things. Not similar things, the same things, from different squadrons, off different carriers, from opposite corners of an ocean thousands of miles wide. At first, the plain facts. It was faster than they'd been told. It climbed back to altitude when it had no business climbing. It was tough. They watched their fire strike it, watched pieces come off it, and watched it keep flying and keep shooting. An airplane they'd hit squarely was supposed to fall. This one turned around and came back. But underneath the facts sat something they could not explain away. The Americans had changed. They didn't dive away anymore when you turned into them. They didn't fly to survive. They pressed. They took the head-on pass instead of avoiding it. They came back for a second run when every rule of self-preservation said, "Go home." Picture one of them. February 1944, over the enemy stronghold at Truk, an American named Eugene Valencia gets jumped by Zeros, the exact situation that, 2 years earlier, had been a death sentence for a man in a Wildcat. He doesn't run. He turns straight into them, attacks head-on, and 3 of them go down. Valencia wasn't a legend that day. He was a good pilot in an airplane that let a good pilot be aggressive and live. That was the whole difference. The Hellcat gave American nerve somewhere solid to stand. 2 years earlier, a move like that head-on charge would have been a good way to die. Now, it was a good way to win, because the man making it was flying something that would still be there when the smoke cleared. The airplane hadn't just changed the odds. It had changed what an American pilot was allowed to imagine doing, and it wasn't one man having one good day. It was the new normal. Dive from height, in pairs, in fours, out of the sun, hit hard, climb away, and come back around before the enemy could set his feet. Every pass on American terms. Every pass a choice. The enemy could no longer decide the shape of the fight. He could only answer it. A beat late, a beat behind, reacting to something an American had already set in motion. And in the air, the man reacting has already lost the most important battle, the one for the initiative, before a shot is even fired. And when the fight went badly for a moment, the airplane forgave the mistake. A pilot could take a hit, shrug it off in all that armor and structure, firewall the throttle, and be gone before the enemy could finish the job. The margin the Americans now flew with was enormous, and the enemy felt every inch of it. The young pilots flying those planes were learning something their older brothers hadn't been able to afford to believe in 1942, that they could go looking for a fight instead of bracing for one. And the man who'd shot down 6 enemy planes in 8 minutes over the Philippine Sea, Alex Vraciu, had learned his trade flying wing on Butch O'Hare himself. The line ran straight from the men who held on in the dark days to the men now doing the hunting. Before this plane, the Americans built everything they did around one question: how do we survive the Zero's strengths? Now they built everything around a different one: how do we destroy its weaknesses? Small change in words, the entire war in practice. And on the other side of it sat the man Japan counted on most, Saburo Sakai, the same enemy who'd beaten Pug Sutherland back in '42, was the ace Japan pointed to when it wanted to believe it could still win the air. So watch what the American airplane did to him. June 24th, 1944. The sky over Iwo Jima. A pack of Hellcats, off the carriers Hornet and Baton, closes on a single zero. The man inside it is the pilot Japan trusted above almost any other. For nearly half an hour, he does not get to be an ace. He rolls, he skids, he breaks, and breaks, and breaks again. He does not land a meaningful shot on anyone. He runs, and when the clouds finally give him cover, he hides in them and slips away. That was the best outcome available to the best man Japan had left. Not a victory, not even a fight. Half an hour of running and the privilege of living to run again. When he set down, the ground crews walked the length of his airplane looking for damage, and the story they told afterward wasn't about how well he'd flown. It was that the Americans had owned that sky so completely they'd turned Japan's most trusted pilot into a man with nothing left to do but survive. And here is where that strange word starts to make sense. The thing about the Hellcat wasn't that it was terrifying in the moment. It was that it never stopped. You could get a Hellcat off your tail. You could not keep it away. It would dive out of your reach, climb back into the sun, and come again from a new direction. And again. There was always another angle. There was always another pass. You couldn't win by not losing anymore. The Americans had taken that option off the table. You broke away clean. You caught your breath. You thought you'd bought yourself a little room. And there it was again, coming down out of the sun, already lining up the next pass. There was no version of the fight where you got to be the hunter. There was only how long you could keep being the hunted. And then, eventually, the fuel gauge dropped, or your eyes flicked to the wrong quarter of the sky for half a second, and the Hellcat was there. I've read a lot of these Japanese accounts over the years, and what stays with me isn't the fear in them, it's the tiredness. That's the word. Exhausting. Not because the Hellcat frightened them, because it never, for 1 second, let them rest. Now go back to Alex Vraciu and the 8 minutes we opened with. June 19th, 1944. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. You understand it now. 6 enemy planes in 8 minutes, on 360 rounds, wasn't a miracle, and it wasn't luck. It was what happened when everything arrived at once. The airplane, the training, and a generation of American pilots who no longer flew afraid. And there was one more American advantage in that sky, and it wasn't in any cockpit. It was on the ships. Down in the dark, in front of the radar screens, Americans were tracking the incoming raids while they were still miles out, and talking their Hellcats onto them by radio, sending them to exactly the right place, at exactly the right altitude, before the enemy even arrived. How they built that system is a story for another time. But the effect, that day, was total. The Hellcats weren't just better airplanes, they knew where to be. And Vraciu was one story in a sky full of them. That same day, a commander named David McCampbell led his fighters against a wave of Japanese aircraft bearing down on the fleet, and shot down 7 of them himself. Up and down the formation, it was happening over and over. Man after man was becoming an ace in a single afternoon. For the Americans in those cockpits, the sky was so full of enemy planes and so empty of real danger that it stopped feeling like the war they'd trained for. There were more targets than there was time to shoot them. An American said it was like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The name stuck, and it stuck because, from the American side of it, that is exactly what it had become. Over 2 days, the Japanese Navy lost close to 600 aircraft, and 3 of its carriers went to the bottom, 2 of them sent down by American submarines waiting beneath the battle, 1 of them broken open by American planes. The enemy had come out for a decisive fight. He got a decisive answer. The Americans lost 123 planes. But sit with that American number a moment, because it hides something. Most of those 123 were not shot down at all. The enemy barely touched them. They were lost on the night of the 20th, young American pilots coming home in the dark after the second day's strike, running their tanks dry, going into the black water because there was no more fuel left to reach the deck. The Zero, the airplane that had once terrified them, was hardly even a factor in their losses anymore. The ocean took more of them than the enemy did. That is how far it had turned. 4 months later, one last picture. October 24th, 1944, at the opening of the battle for Leyte Gulf. David McCampbell, the same man from the turkey shoot, climbs, with a single wingman, into a formation of about 60 Japanese aircraft. 2 Americans, 60 of them. He doesn't wait for better odds. He wades in. He picks them apart, one and then another, working the edges of the formation, breaking it up, forcing it to scatter, a slow, deliberate dismantling of a force 30 times his own number. When it was done, McCampbell had shot down 9, 7 Zeros and 2 Army fighters in a single mission. No American had ever done that. No American ever did it again. And when he finally turned for home, his own carrier's deck wasn't clear, so he put down on another one, the Langley. They checked his guns. 2 rounds left. They checked his fuel. There wasn't any. They had to push the airplane off the arresting wire by hand, because it couldn't even taxi. He'd flown it until there was nothing left to fly it with. 34 victories all told. The highest scoring ace in the history of the United States Navy, the Medal of Honor. And McCampbell was not alone at the top. Before the war ended, that one airplane, the Hellcat, would carry more American pilots to ace status than any other fighter the country flew. Better than 300 of them, young men who had climbed into that cockpit unproven and climbed out as some of the deadliest fighter pilots in the world. It didn't just make heroes. It made them by the 100, and it made them out of ordinary Americans, farm kids, college boys, men who'd never touched an airplane before the war, because the machine and the system behind it were built to lift an ordinary man to something extraordinary and bring him home to tell about it. Behind all of it sat a quieter truth. Japan had burned through its veteran pilots and had no way to make more of them fast enough. America had built something else. Not just airplanes, but a system for turning ordinary young men into veterans and turning them out faster than the enemy could shoot them down. One side was fighting with pieces it could never replace. The other side was fighting with a machine that made more of everything. More planes, more pilots, more of the men who'd flown wing on the aces and were now leading flights of their own. By the end, the Hellcat's record read like something invented. 19 enemy aircraft shot down for every one of its own lost in air combat. Roughly 3 out of every 4 aerial victories the entire Navy scored in that ocean. But numbers like that don't come from one plane being a little better than another. They come from an air force that no longer flew afraid, flying against one that had run out of everything but the running. And the men in those cockpits weren't only winning dogfights. They were prying open the map. The Marianas fell, and with them came the airfields that, for the first time in the war, put American bombers within reach of Japan's home islands. From those islands, the long-range bombers would soon be taking off toward the enemy's cities and factories, night after night. The exhaustion those Japanese pilots felt in the air was about to become something their whole country would feel. And it had begun with a fighter plane that simply would not let their pilots rest. By late 1944, exhaustion wasn't something one Japanese pilot felt in one cockpit. It was the condition of an entire enemy air force, and America had put it there. So think again about the word. What America left its enemy was not fear. Fear, a fighting man can do something with. Fear sharpens you. It can be answered. You can climb into the cockpit afraid and still find a way to win. Exhaustion is what's left after that door closes. It's what remains when the enemy has quietly taken away your ability to ever be the one on the attack and left you nothing but the escape. That's what those men were describing, in their different years, and their different words. Not a plane that scared them. A plane and a country standing behind it that never once gave them room to breathe. And it started in that factory on Long Island. The people at Bethpage had, in a real sense, decided how it would end before the first Hellcat ever rolled onto a carrier deck. Not with a miracle, with a decision. Add the armor, seal the tanks, give it the power, build the whole thing around the man inside it, and bring him home. Every one of those choices cost weight, and cost money, and cost time on the drawing board. The easy path was the light path. Strip it down, chase the numbers, let the pilot take his chances. America chose the harder road on purpose. It decided its young men were worth the extra armor, worth the heavier engine, worth the thousands of extra hours on the line. That decision is the whole reason this story ends the way it does. They built more than 12,000 of them. And when the shooting finally stopped, that airplane had done more of the Navy's fighting in the Pacific than any other plane in the sky, and had brought more of its pilots back down that wire than anyone in 1942 would have dared to promise. Think about what that number really is. It isn't just a production figure or a victory tally. It's a count of American men who climbed out of the cockpit at the end of the day and grew old and had children and grandchildren because somebody in Bethpage decided the armor stayed in. Picture the last image of it. A Hellcat coming back to the carrier at the end of a long day, punched full of holes, streaked, scorched, and battered, settling onto the deck, tailhook grabbing the wire, and the canopy slides back, and the pilot climbs out. That airplane was built to do the one thing the Zero was never built to do. It was built to lose a fight and still bring its man back. It was built so that a country could spend steel instead of spending suns. And it did it, thousands of times over, across 3 years and 10,000 miles of ocean. If your father or your grandfather flew in the Pacific, or worked the line at a plant like Bethpage, or served on one of the ships these planes came home to, then you may be holding a piece of this story that no archive ever wrote down, the kind of thing that only ever gets told across a kitchen table. Tell it to us in the comments. Those stories are history too, and they deserve to outlast all of us, because in the end, the men on the other side were left with a single word for what America sent against them. Not deadly, not unbeatable, exhausting. The word you reach for when you're up against an enemy and a machine that has simply stopped being afraid.
June 4th, 1942. 10:22 in the morning. 3 of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy are on fire. Aboard the Akagi, Japan's flagship, the pride of their fleet, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo receives the reports one after another. Akagi, hit. Kaga, hit. Sōryū, hit. In the span of a few minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers have been dealt a fatal blow. The 4th, the Hiryu, is still out there. She is already preparing her counterstrike. But Nagumo, standing among the reports, is not thinking about the Hiryu. He doesn't understand what just happened to the other 3. And he doesn't understand why. Not because he lacked information, not because the Americans had prepared better than he expected, but because of a single sentence written in the dark hours of that same morning, before a single shot had been fired, that no one on his staff had ever questioned. After the war, that sentence appeared in Japan's internal battle records. Then someone removed it. One of Nagumo's own officers, the man responsible for compiling the official report of the battle, quietly left it out. He never told the historians. He never told the authors of Japan's official war history series. He carried that omission for 70 years. And then, in 2012, at the end of his life, he finally told a Japanese historian what he had done. According to the Naval War College Review, published by the United States Naval War College, what that sentence contained was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. We're going to read that sentence today. But first, we need to talk about the man who wrote the version of Midway that you already know, and why even Japan's own historians stopped trusting him decades ago. Here is something most people don't realize. Everything the Western world knows about what happened on the Japanese side at Midway, every book, every documentary, every film, every YouTube video you've ever watched on the subject, traces back to a single source. One man. His name was Mitsuo Fuchida. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Fuchida was the senior air officer who led the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He was present on the Akagi during the Battle of Midway, and when the war ended, he was one of the very few senior officers who had been at the center of both attacks and survived to write about them. In 1955, he published a book, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. It was translated into English almost immediately. American publishers promoted it. American historians cited it. The 1976 film, Midway, the one with Henry Fonda and Hal Holbrook, drew heavily from his account. For the better part of 5 decades, if you were an American trying to understand what happened on the Japanese side of that battle, Fuchida was your primary source. Most people who've written about Midway in English have built on his account, whether they knew it or not. Now step back for a moment. In 1971, 16 years after Fuchida's book came out, Japan released something called the Senshi Sosho, 102 volumes. It was Japan's official military history of the war, compiled by the Japanese government from internal documents, operational records, and materials that had never been made public. Volume 43 covered the Battle of Midway. It was not translated into English. For decades, 2 versions of the same battle existed side by side. The one Americans were reading, and the one Japan's own historians had produced from their own classified records. They were not the same. Jonathan Parshall spent the better part of 10 years working through Japanese primary sources, documents that had never been used by Western historians writing about the Pacific War. In 2005, he and Anthony Tully published Shattered Sword through the Naval Institute Press. And then, in the spring 2010 edition of the Naval War College Review, the academic journal of the institution that trains America's admirals, Parshall wrote something that is worth reading carefully. He wrote, "Fuchida's impact on the history of the Pacific War has been enormously damaging, in that his elaborations have been parroted for years and handed down as truth on the big screen, on television, and in countless internet chat rooms. That is not a casual opinion from a blogger. That is a trained historian, writing in a peer-reviewed military journal, making a direct and documented case that the foundational account of Midway that Americans have accepted for half a century does not hold up against the Japanese records that actually survived the war. Now, why would Fuchida write something that didn't match Japan's own official documents? Consider the circumstances. He published in 1955. Japan had surrendered 10 years earlier. The Imperial Japanese Navy, an institution that had existed for 70 years, the source of enormous national pride, had been dissolved. The men who served in it had lost. Fuchida wasn't just writing history. He was writing for an audience that had suffered one of the most devastating national humiliations in modern memory. Parshall put it plainly in his research. The goal, he wrote, was to find some sense of national pride that might be regained by revealing some moments of nobility within that defeat. That is not a condemnation. That is a human explanation for why a man shapes a story the way he needs it to be shaped. But the consequence has been that for decades, every American who thought they understood what happened on the Japanese side of Midway was reading a version of events that Japan's own scholars had long since set aside. There is a Japanese official history of the Battle of Midway that most Americans have never had access to. There are internal records, message logs, battle reports compiled in the immediate aftermath of the fighting, documents that tell a different story than the one Fuchida wanted the world to hear. And buried inside one of those documents, in a message log compiled on the morning of June 4th, before the first American bomb fell, is the sentence that was quietly removed, the sentence that one officer carried in silence for 70 years. That's where we're going next. If this is the first time you've heard any of this, you're probably not the only one. If you think someone else should know this story exists, A-like takes about 1 second and puts it in front of people who've never seen it. 8 days before the battle. May 27th, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton walks into Admiral Chester Nimitz's office at Pearl Harbor and sets a piece of paper on the desk. On it, he has written the following. The Japanese carriers will attack on the morning of June 4th. They will approach from the northwest, on a bearing of 325 degrees. They will be approximately 175 miles from Midway at 7 o'clock in the morning. That's it. Date, direction, distance, time. Nimitz reads it. He doesn't ask for a second opinion. He doesn't wait for Washington to confirm it. He doesn't hedge. He deploys his entire available carrier force, all 3 ships, including the USS Yorktown, which had taken serious damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea less than a month earlier, and had been estimated to need 3 months of repairs. Nimitz told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days. They gave him 72 hours. The Yorktown steamed out of dry dock and headed north to meet the Japanese fleet. On the morning of June 4th, as the first American scout reports began coming in, Nimitz turned to Layton and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off. 5 miles, 5 degrees, 5 minutes, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, how does something like that happen? It doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of a deliberate choice Nimitz made about how he wanted to receive information. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the United States Navy's own historical authority, recorded what Nimitz told Layton when he first took command of the Pacific Fleet, in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. He told Layton that his job was to think like Admiral Yamamoto, not to brief Nimitz on what was happening, not to summarize intercepts, not to tell him what the intelligence said, to think like the enemy commander, to get inside his head and tell Nimitz what Yamamoto was going to do next, even when the evidence was incomplete, even when Washington disagreed, even when being wrong would mean career consequences for everyone in the room. That is a very specific thing to ask of an intelligence officer. It means the job is not to confirm. It means the job is to challenge. And Nimitz built his entire pre-battle planning around that principle. According to Proceedings, the flagship journal of the United States Naval Institute, Nimitz and his staff did not simply accept intelligence estimates at face value. They made a deliberate effort to understand the tradecraft behind the estimates they were receiving. Washington, at that same moment, was telling Nimitz he was wrong. The army on Oahu believed the Japanese were coming back to hit Pearl Harbor again. Naval intelligence in Washington thought the attack would fall somewhere in the South Pacific, possibly Australia, possibly the Aleutians. Nimitz listened to all of it. And then he trusted the 2 men who had spent years living in Japan, learning the language, studying the culture, and reading Yamamoto's communications with their own eyes. Rochefort and Layton, not because they told him what he wanted to hear, because he understood exactly how they had reached their conclusions. There is one more thing worth knowing about how Nimitz operated. In the spring of 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort, the head of Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, came to Nimitz with an unusual proposal. The Americans were almost certain that the Japanese target was Midway Island, referred to in Japanese communications only by the code letters AF. Almost certain, but not certain enough. Rochefort proposed a test. He would have the garrison at Midway broadcast an unencrypted message, completely open for anyone to hear, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. If the Japanese were planning to hit Midway, their communications would almost certainly reference the water shortage. Nimitz approved it. Within hours, American listening stations intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that their target, the location designated AF, was running low on fresh water. The identity of the Japanese objective was no longer almost certain. It was confirmed. What Rochefort proposed was a trap built out of information. What Nimitz did was say yes, when a less confident commander might have said, "That's too clever, too risky, too unorthodox." Keep that word in mind. Unorthodox, because on the other side of the Pacific, at almost exactly the same moment, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. And the men in that room were not in the habit of saying yes to ideas that challenged the plan. We need to go back to the beginning of June 4th, not 10:22 in the morning, when the bombs were already falling. Earlier, much earlier, 5:20 in the morning, local time. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier strike force, is steaming toward Midway in the darkness. The first wave of aircraft has already been launched to attack the island. On the bridge of the Akagi, Air Staff Officer Yoshioka Tadakazu is compiling the morning's operational log. He records the weather, wind speed, sea state, visibility, the bearing and speed of the fleet, standard entries. And then, before moving on, he writes one more line, a single sentence recording the staff's intelligence estimate for the day ahead. The sentence read, "It is calculated that the enemy Kido Butai will not be encountered today." The enemy carrier force will not be encountered today. That was the official assessment of Nagumo's staff at 5:20 in the morning on June 4th, 1942. Less than 5 hours later, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were gone. Now, here is what that sentence is not. It is not a tactical error. It is not a failure of nerve. It is not a decision made under pressure by a man who should have known better. It is something quieter than that, and more consequential. According to the Naval War College Review, Spring 2015, published by the United States Naval War College, that sentence is evidence of something that shaped everything that followed on June 4th. The journal's authors wrote, Nagumo and his staff did not expect, and therefore did not even prepare for, contact with an enemy carrier force on the morning of June 4th. Everything that followed flows from this faulty estimate of the situation. Everything that followed. The rearming of the aircraft, the delays, the confusion on the flight decks, the 40 minutes of indecision that everyone has spent 80 years arguing about. All of it flows from one thing, a staff that went into battle without ever genuinely asking whether American carriers might be waiting for them. Not because the question was impossible, because the question was never asked. Think about what Leighton was doing at roughly the same hour on the other side of the Pacific. He was sitting with his charts and his intercepts, building a picture of exactly where the Japanese fleet would be, when it would arrive, and what it would do. He had been asked to think like the enemy. On the Akagi, no one had been asked to think like the Americans. The assessment was not a prediction. It was an assumption. And assumptions, unlike predictions, do not require evidence. They only require confidence. Now we come to the second part of this story. The sentence Yoshioka wrote that morning was included in the raw message log. After the battle, when Yoshioka was assigned the task of compiling the official post-battle report, what historians have since called the Nagumo Report, he made a decision. He left that sentence out. He did not misplace it. He did not forget it. He removed it. The official report that went up the chain of command, the report that would become part of the permanent record of the Imperial Japanese Navy, did not contain the line that said the staff had not expected to find American carriers that morning. And then, decades later, when Japan was compiling its official war history, the Senshi Sōshō, the 102-volume series drawn from internal military records, Yoshioka did not tell the historians about it then either. According to the Naval War College Review, the omission was not even disclosed to the writers of the Senshi Sōshō. The official history of the war did not know the sentence existed. Yoshioka kept it to himself for 70 years. In 2012, a Japanese historian named Mori Shiro published a book called Midway Kaitsen, Naval Battle of Midway. It contained interviews with surviving participants, some of them released only after the subjects had died. One of the most significant was with Yoshioka himself. In that interview, Yoshioka admitted what he had done. He acknowledged the omission, and he told Mori why. He said he had removed it, in his own words, to protect the Navy's reputation. The Naval War College Review, analyzing his admission, was direct about what the deletion meant, that there had been, among a select group of surviving officers, an understanding about how the defeat at Midway was to be presented to history. The mental unreadiness of the Kido Butai for encountering an American carrier force on the morning of June 4th, that was to be downplayed, suppressed if possible. Instead, the story that would be told was one of misfortune and timing, bad luck, narrow margins, the fog of war, not an assumption that was never challenged, not a staff that went to battle having already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. It is worth pausing here to consider what Yoshioka was actually protecting. By 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had existed as an institution for 70 years. It had won at Tsushima in 1905. It had surprised the world at Pearl Harbor. Its officers were trained from childhood to believe that the Navy represented something larger than any individual battle. Yoshioka was not protecting himself. He was protecting that. That is not an excuse. It is a fact. And it explains something about why the sentence stayed missing for as long as it did. There is one more layer to this. Japan's own official war history, the Senshi Sōshō, Volume 43, contains a finding that sits quietly alongside everything else we've discussed. It concerns the mechanics of what would have had to happen on the Japanese carriers for Nagumo to mount any kind of response, even if he had received a warning in time. The Senshi Sōshō states that the procedure for bringing aircraft up from the hangars, positioning them on the flight deck, arming them, fueling them, and preparing them for launch would have taken, at minimum, 40 minutes. 40 minutes, even if Nagumo had known, even if the question had been asked, even if someone on his staff had looked at the intelligence that morning and said, "Wait." The carriers couldn't have responded in time, which means the problem was not just one sentence in a morning log. It was a system, built entirely around the assumption that surprise would always belong to Japan. A system with no contingency for the morning, it didn't. Now consider the 40 minutes of decisions that everyone has spent decades arguing about. Between 7:15 and roughly 8 o'clock that morning, Nagumo received 3 separate pieces of contradictory information in less than an hour. At 7:15, he ordered his reserve aircraft to swap their torpedoes for land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. His scout planes had reported no American ships in the area. At 7:28, one of his scout planes reported 10 enemy surface ships to the northeast. No carriers mentioned. Nagumo halted the rearming. At 7:45, a follow-up report. One of the ships appeared to be a carrier. Now his flight decks were covered with aircraft in mid-rearm, some with bombs, some with torpedoes, fuel lines running across the deck, ordnance stacked in the open. And his first strike wave was already returning from Midway, low on fuel, needing to land. The Naval War College Review, the same 2015 analysis that identified the deleted sentence, makes a point that is easy to miss in the decades of criticism directed at Nagumo. It states that his decisions, given the information he had at each moment, were not unreasonable. Each individual choice, viewed in isolation, had a logic to it. The problem was not that Nagumo made bad decisions under pressure. The problem was that he was making decisions inside a situation that his own staff's morning assessment had told him would never exist. He was improvising inside a scenario that his command had already concluded was impossible. The sentence that said the American carriers would not be encountered today. That sentence set the frame for everything. It was written at 5:20 in the morning, removed from the record after the battle, hidden from Japan's own historians for 3 decades, and according to the officer who removed it, speaking at the end of his life to a historian who was willing to listen, it was the real reason Japan lost the Battle of Midway. The question worth asking is this: where did that assumption come from? The one written into the morning log. The one that said the Americans wouldn't be there. It didn't appear on June 4th. It was built, carefully, methodically, 5 weeks earlier. May 1st through May 4th, 1942. Aboard the battleship Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima, the most powerful warship ever constructed, Yamamoto's personal flagship, the senior commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy gathered for a tabletop war game. The formal purpose was to stress-test the Midway plan before committing the fleet to it. Find the weaknesses, challenge the assumptions, work out what could go wrong. That was the purpose. What actually happened was something different. On the second day of the exercise, the officer commanding the simulated American forces sent a flight of land-based bombers from Midway Island to attack the Japanese carrier group. The dice were thrown. The result: 9 hits on the Japanese carriers. By the rules of the exercise, that meant 2 carriers were sunk. Akagi and Kaga, the same 2 carriers that would lead the actual attack, were ruled destroyed. The chief umpire of the exercise was Rear Admiral Ugaki Matome, Yamamoto's own chief of staff. Ugaki looked at the result, and then he set it aside. He reduced the number of hits from 9 to 3. Under his revised ruling, Kaga was still sunk. But Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, the ship where Yoshioka would sit down 5 weeks later to write his morning log, Akagi survived. The exercise continued. Later, in the portion of the game covering the operations that would follow Midway, even Kaga quietly reappeared, restored to the Japanese order of battle, as if her earlier sinking had never occurred. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in Shattered Sword, described the 4 days of exercises as a mockery of professional staff work. The Naval History and Heritage Command, the official historical authority of the United States Navy, recorded what happened when the American player attempted something more realistic. At one point during the exercise, the officer playing the American side positioned his carriers to the north of Midway and launched a strike from an unexpected angle. The attack worked. It worked the same way the real American attack would work, 5 weeks later, in almost exactly the same location. The Naval History and Heritage Command noted that his actions were ruled impossible by the umpire, and the Japanese game losses were restored. His name is not recorded in any document that has survived the war. He played the Americans correctly. He was told that wasn't how the Americans would fight, and the planning session moved on. There was one more moment worth knowing about. During the planning meetings that accompanied the exercise, Vice Admiral Kondo Nobutak, commander of the Second Fleet, one of the most senior officers present, asked a direct question. If Japan captured Midway, how would the island be resupplied? The atoll was more than 1,000 miles from the nearest major Japanese base. Keeping it supplied would require a sustained logistical effort that the Navy had not fully planned for. Yamamoto's own chief of staff acknowledged that resupply might not be possible. The question hung in the air for a moment. No one pursued it. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier strike force, said nothing. He had reason to stay quiet. Yamamoto had criticized him sharply for not ordering a third strike at Pearl Harbor, for pulling back when Yamamoto believed he should have pressed. The relationship between the two men was strained. Nagumo was not in a position to challenge the plan. The meeting ended. The plan was approved as written. Kondo's question and the Chief of Staff's answer did not appear in the meeting record. Now hold that image. A planning session aboard the most powerful ship in the world. A war game where unfavorable results were revised until they came out right. An officer who played the Americans correctly and was told his moves were impossible. A direct question about a fatal flaw in the plan that was acknowledged, then dropped, then left out of the record. And then come back to Pearl Harbor. Same weeks, same month, different room. Nimitz is telling Leighton that his job, his only job, is to think like the enemy, not to confirm, to challenge. Rochefort is in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, working through intercepts, and coming to Nimitz with ideas that sound, on their face, unorthodox, like sending a fake message about broken water equipment to trap the Japanese into revealing their own target. And Nimitz is saying yes. There are no umpires overruling the results in the basement of Station Hypo. There is no senior officer adjusting the dice rolls until the outcome matches the plan. The two rooms are not that far apart in time. They are separated by an ocean, and by something harder to measure. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey is flying at 20,000 feet over an empty stretch of the Pacific Ocean. He is the Air Group Commander of the USS Enterprise. He has been in the air for nearly 2 hours. His fuel is running low. The Japanese fleet is not where it was supposed to be. Nagumo had changed course that morning, the result of evasive maneuvering under repeated American attacks from Midway, and the Kido Butai was no longer where it was expected to be. McCluskey reaches the estimated point of interception and finds nothing. He has no updated position report, no new orders from the Enterprise, no way to know where the Japanese have gone. He has a decision to make. He could turn back. His fuel situation was becoming critical. Every minute of additional searching increased the risk that he and his pilots would run dry before they could land. He chose to keep searching. He extended his flight to the southwest, then turned north, a calculated guess about where the Japanese carriers might have gone. 20 minutes later, he saw something below him. A single Japanese destroyer, steaming at full speed toward the northeast. The ship was the Arashi. She had spent the morning attacking the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese fleet, and was now racing to rejoin the main formation. McCluskey watched her bow cut through the water, pointing like an arrow. He followed it. At 10 o'clock in the morning, he spotted the wakes of the Japanese carriers. 22 minutes later, at 10:22, his dive bombers rolled into their attack runs. Nimitz later described McCluskey's decision, the choice to keep searching, to extend the flight, to follow the destroyer, as having decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at a Midway. That is not a small thing to say about one man's choice on a morning when everything was uncertain. McCluskey had no orders for that situation. No one had told him what to do if the Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. He made a judgment call. And it worked. That afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise located the Sōryū and left her burning without the ability to launch aircraft. She was scuttled the following morning, By June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers were gone. What happened next is less often told. Before the surviving Japanese ships had even returned to port at Hashirajima, before the fleet had anchored on June 14th, senior Navy officers were already discussing how the battle would be presented. Jonathan Parshall, writing in Naval History magazine in 2007, documented what followed. The official announcement to the Japanese public described Midway as a victory. 2 American carriers had been sunk, it said. Japan had prevailed. The Akagi and the Sōryū, both at the bottom of the Pacific, were kept on the Navy's official roster, listed not as sunk, listed as unmanned. Sailors who had been wounded at Midway were separated from the general hospital population. They were not allowed to communicate with their families. They were not permitted to tell anyone what had happened. Not a single admiral was relieved of command. Not Yamamoto. Not Nagumo. The institution closed around the defeat the way water closes around a stone, and Yoshioka, sitting down sometime after the battle to compile the official report, made his own small contribution to that effort. He removed a sentence. One sentence, the one that would have shown, in the Navy's own words, written by one of its own officers, at 5:20 in the morning before a single shot had been fired, that the staff of the Kido Butai had already decided the Americans wouldn't be there. On the morning of June 4th, as the first scout reports confirmed that the Japanese fleet was exactly where Leighton said it would be, Nimitz turned to his intelligence officer and said, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." Leighton had told him the fleet would be 175 miles from Midway. It was 180. He had said bearing 325 degrees. It was 320. He had said 7 o'clock in the morning. It was 5 minutes past. 5 miles. 5 degrees. 5 minutes. In the middle of an ocean that covers a third of the Earth's surface. That is what it looks like when an institution builds a system designed to find the truth. Even when the truth is inconvenient. Even when Washington disagrees. Even when the answer changes the plan entirely. On the other side of that ocean, an institution built a system designed to protect the plan, even when the war game said it would fail, even when an officer asked a question that had no comfortable answer, even when the morning log recorded an assumption that the enemy would simply not appear. The assumption was wrong, and the man who wrote it down spent the rest of his life making sure no one would know. Yoshioka kept quiet for 70 years. A lot of the men who were actually there did the same thing. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, what did they tell you about it? Or what did they never talk about? Those silences say something too. Leave it in the comments. I'm asking because I genuinely want to know.